Welcome to my lesson on human capital, theory, and the economic value of education. The purpose of this lesson is to hopefully give you as a student a foundation in why investing in education can produce a long-term economic benefit for each of you. And hopefully in doing so, give you the motivation to get the most out of your educational experience for your own economic benefit. My lesson consists of 4 sections. And to start with, I want to begin by looking at human capital on a global scale. When we look at a map of the world, we see 196 countries with their unique political borders, and we see all of the unique individual cultures and languages. Another way to look at this map, though, is through an economic perspective. There are 196 countries, so there are 196 economies. Each economy, each country, has its own unique allocation of economic resources that contribute to the wealth of that country. One resource that every country shares is its population. Now, from an economic perspective, there's 2 ways to look at population. On the one hand, you can look at population as the domestic market where goods and services are sold. On the other hand, you can look at the population as the domestic labor force, out of which the productive capacity of the country is generated. And that's really the focus of human capital theory. Human capital theory focuses not on the quantity, but on the quality of the domestic population. And it focuses on investments in human development that create economic growth. There's 3 primary investments that typically we refer to when we discuss human capital. The first is education, healthcare, and migration. These are investments that have a time value in an economic sense, that produce returns over an extended period, even after the initial consumption decisions. Now, there's really striking global data to support the importance of human capital. What I have here is a world education chart. On the x-axis, you see GDP per capita. On the y-axis is the average number of years of schooling. Each bubble represents an individual country. And what you see is a strong positive correlation moving up and to the right that shows that as GDP per capita increases, so do average years of schooling. The evidence is equally as strong if we look at individual comparisons. So for instance, if we compare Norway to Niger, Norway has the highest average number of years of schooling of any country in the world, at 12.6 years. It has a similarly high life expectancy at 81 years and a GDP per capita of over $97,000 US dollars. That is roughly almost twice as much as the US GDP per capita. In comparison, Niger has the lowest average number of years of schooling at 1.4 years. The life expectancy is 58 years, and the GDP per capita is a little over $3,000. This comparison not only demonstrates the incredible gap between the developed and the developing world, but also shows you the profound impact of investments in human capital. At this point in the lesson, I would ask students to compare 4 separate countries: Ethiopia, Canada, Mexico, and Vietnam. I would call on 3 students to rank these countries on 3 different metrics: average number of years of schooling, life expectancy, and GDP per capita. Once they had done so, I would reveal that the rankings were the same for all 3 metrics, reinforcing my point about the importance of human capital investment. The second part of my lesson delves into the US labor market and focuses on educational attainment in the US. When we look at the US population overall, there is approximately 322 million people. The actual labor force in the United States, however, is only 154.9 million people. That's compared to a non-working population of 167 million. We can break down the U.S. labor force in a number of different ways. One of the more valuable ways is to look at individual industries. So for instance, we can look at the fact that human services, which incorporates education and healthcare, employs almost 33 million people. Other large sectors of the U.S. labor force include professional services, retail, and manufacturing. Another way to divide up the U.S. labor force is by looking at the highest level of educational attainment. And this pie chart breaks down the U.S. population over the age of 18 based on the highest level of degrees earned. You can see that high school graduates make up the largest proportion of the population, followed by those with some college and those with bachelor's degrees. You can see in the green slice, approximately 17.9 million people have master's degrees. That may seem like a large number, but in reality, that's only 7% of the overall population. And the proportion only gets smaller as you go to higher degrees, like professional degrees or doctoral degrees. Now, it's interesting when you look at the labor force to consider different career paths, different jobs. What I've done here is I've listed 4 different careers: bartenders, mail carriers, librarians, and lawyers. And what I've done is I've broken down each career by educational attainment level. And what you can see here is that certain careers, for instance lawyers, require almost exclusively a very high level of educational attainment. Other careers, like librarians, are sort of somewhere in the middle with a preference towards master's degrees. Bartenders and mail carriers, as less skilled careers, don't require as much educational attainment. So for each student, it's important to understand what are your career goals, what career will you be working in, and what are the educational attainments, requirements to achieve your goals in your chosen career path. With that said, ultimately the economy is just an aggregation of individuals. Each person in the economy represents their own economic actor. I've highlighted 2 people here: Bill Gates from Microsoft, LeBron James of the NBA. Each person employs their own unique skills and abilities to create an economic future for themselves. Bill Gates would probably not be very successful if he played basketball. LeBron James would probably not be very successful if he tried to develop software. But each is able to employ their own individual skills to create a viable economic future for themselves. So that makes me ask, what determines human capital? Well, I would argue it's a combination of things. There are physical elements, there are emotional elements, there are intellectual elements. And education can contribute to some of these things, but not all of them. And so for each of us, it's important to think about what is the human capital that we currently possess? And what are the opportunities that we have to add to that human capital that are going to make us more productive, more effective, and more capable? At this point in the lesson, I'd ask students to identify these 3 individuals. We have Larry Page from Google, one of the founders of Google, John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and Jay-Z, a rap musician. And I'd call on 3 students, and I'd ask each of them to discuss one of these individuals and talk about what they think contributes to each one of these people being successful and what comprises their individual human capital profiles. The third part of my lesson gets into marginal productivity and how it relates to human capital. And I'd introduce this topic by discussing outputs versus inputs. If I'm a factory owner, outputs are the things that make me money. They are the products and the goods and services that earn me revenue, that keep me in business. Inputs are the things that I need to create outputs. Things like raw materials, labor, factory space, and equipment. The problem with inputs, though, is that they cost me money. And so as a factory owner, I'm going to be very focused on the level of efficiency that each input provides me. And this is where we get into the idea of marginal productivity. Each input has its own level of marginal productivity. The marginal productivity of labor concerns how incremental changes in the amount of labor will create incremental changes in the amount of output. The marginal productivity of labor is typically abbreviated as MPL, and MPL is typically expressed by the equation change in Y, or change in output, over change in L, or change in labor. So basically, how much does output change for each change in labor? Now, why is marginal productivity of labor important? Essentially, marginal productivity represents the value of the worker to the firm. A higher marginal productivity means that a worker is more productive, is capable of being more productive and more valuable. That's why, ultimately, marginal productivity determines wages. Now, to highlight this, I want to show an example. We have worker A and worker B. To produce 8 additional units, worker A will require 4 additional units of labor. That makes worker A's marginal productivity equal to 2. Worker B can produce the same increase in output of 8 units, but by only using 2 more units of labor. As a result, the marginal productivity for worker B is twice that of worker A. That means that worker B is roughly twice as productive as worker A. What that means from a wage standpoint is that worker B is more valuable and hence will be paid more, theoretically, by the firm because of that differential in productivity. Now, what makes worker B more productive than worker A? Well, there's no easy answer to that question, but one of the basic assumptions of human capital is that education contributes to the productive growth of individual workers. And there's 2 forms of education that can do that. One is general education. General education is any form of education that increases the productivity and the value of the worker regardless of the employer. For that reason, employers are not eager to provide general education to their employees because as soon as they get the benefit, they could walk out the door. As a result, general education is typically provided by schools and universities. Specific education relates to education that is unique to a specific employer. As such, firms themselves provide that training, and they need to offer incentives for workers to participate in that training. But once workers receive that training, they can't walk out the door and go to another employer and use those same skills. Typically, the most valuable worker is a worker who combines both high levels of general education with high levels of specific education. At this point, I would ask the students to break up into groups of 3s. In their small groups, I would ask them to share with each other 4 general areas of education that they feel that they possess, along with 1 specific area of expertise or knowledge. I would also ask them to share with each other how those different abilities have benefited them and how they developed or learned those abilities in the first place. Once they had shared in small groups, I would then reconvene the class and ask for volunteers to share their personal responses. So the final segment of my lesson really gets down into what everybody wants to know. and that is, how does human capital relate to employment and earnings? When we think about this data, it's very hard to determine on an individual basis the individual effect that any educational experience is going to have on a single person's earnings and employment level. But with that said, when we look at aggregate data, when we look at averages, there's very compelling evidence about how education contributes to human capital and contributes to income and employment. So over the past 30 years, we've seen the level of education in the US rise considerably. We've seen the level of master's degrees from 1970 to 2005 increase by 170%. Some would argue that as the number of degrees awarded increases, the value of those degrees decreases. I would argue that there's other data which shows that the economic value of those degrees is as valid as ever, and that is in turn what in fact is driving the growth in degrees. The US Department of Labor produces this chart on a yearly basis. This chart shows two things. On the right-hand side, it shows median weekly earnings in the US. On the left-hand side in the red, it shows the unemployment rate. And down the middle here, it shows these statistics for each educational attainment level. And what you have here through this little line is an average. So the average median weekly earnings of a worker in the United States in 2014 was approximately $839 a week. But we can see from this graph that on average, those holding a bachelor's degree or higher earned higher than the total average for the overall labor force. In comparison, those with an associate's degree or lower earned less than the national average. Similarly, when we look at employment, the average unemployment rate was roughly 5%. But for those holding an associate's degree or higher, the average unemployment rate was less than the national average. At the same time, those with some college or less had higher unemployment rates than the national average. Another study by the US Census Bureau looked at average income and earnings. And what I particularly want to focus on here is the difference between a master's degree and a bachelor's degree. This data show that on average, those holding master's degrees earn $62,000, whereas those holding bachelor's degrees earned approximately $52,000, a difference of roughly $10,000 a year on average. Now that may or may not seem like a lot, but over the course of a lifetime working career, that adds up to approximately a difference of $400,000. Now what's particularly interesting is that data shows that the value of the degree, of advanced degrees, is actually growing. And what this graph shows is a proportional relationship between the earnings of those holding high school degrees, bachelor's degrees, and advanced degrees. The high school degree is held constant as 1. Okay? So bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees both earn proportionally more than those with high school degrees, as we just saw. And you can see that the value of these higher level degrees is increasing. But what's particularly interesting is that over the last 30 years, the proportional difference for those holding advanced degrees has grown quicker and steeper than those holding bachelor's degrees. And in fact, you can see that the gap between high school and bachelor's has gotten wider, but so has the gap between bachelor's and advanced degrees. This is compelling evidence driving the number of advanced degrees that we see being offered. So, revisiting where I started, we know that this information consists of averages, that there are some people who are above average and some people who are below average. So what I want each person to consider and to think about is what strategies and what goals can you set that will help you end up at or above the average as opposed to below the average. Each educational experience is different for each person. What matters most to you and what will help you achieve the goals that you want to? So thank you for listening to my lesson. I have some resources and references here, and hopefully you found that valuable. Thank you.